Dirty boots belong in the Corral, not here," shouted the millionaire CEO, Ricardo, expelling the old farmer who dared to ask for a table at his luxury restaurant in São Paulo. Humiliated in front of everyone, the farmer did not argue. He just grabbed his old cell phone, made a single call and said, "Hello, cancel the delivery to Dom Patricio." Ricardo heard the name of his own restaurant and laughed, until the farmer mentioned the name of his farm, and the CEO fell to his knees begging. The air in Patrician was dense, heavy with the aroma of white truffles and the contented murmur of Manhattan's elite. From his glass-walled throne on the mezzanine, Richard surveyed his kingdom. Every clinking crystal glass was music to his ears. Every plate that returned to the kitchen empty was a silent applause to his genius. This restaurant wasn't just a business, it was the pinnacle of his empire, the crown jewel of a fortune built with cold, calculating ambition. He didn't sell food, he sold status. And status had a specific taste, the beef from Golden Valley Ranch, a myth whispered among gourmands, an exclusivity that justified every penny charged and multiplied his capital at a breathtaking rate. His thoughts drifted between the night's cash flow and the rising value of his stock portfolio on Wall Street. This place was his greatest and most profitable asset, cementing him as one of the most powerful men in the city. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the dining room. The glint of diamonds on a socialite's fingers, the bespoke suit of a banker discussing crypto investments, the restrained laughter of an heiress who barely touched her food. Everything was in perfect harmony, a symphony of wealth and power orchestrated by him, until a dissonant note broke the melody. A man stood at the entrance, an anachronistic figure in this landscape of luxury. His clothes were creased from a long journey, his simple felt hat clashing with the elaborate updos around him. But it was his boots that captured Richard's attention, caked in a reddish, clay-like dust that seemed to stain the immaculate Italian marble with its mere presence. The man, Ben, asked for a table for one in a quiet voice that was barely audible above the room's hum. Richard's jaw tightened. A stain, an unacceptable imperfection in his masterpiece. It was a personal offense. He saw the maitre d's hesitation, the uncomfortable exchange of glances among the staff. This was the moment to reassert his control, to make a spectacle that would remind everyone who was in charge. Slowly, he descended the spiral staircase, his Italian leather shoes echoing in the silence that was beginning to form. The patrons, sensing the shift in atmosphere, turned to watch. Richard stopped before the old rancher, a smirk of contempt playing on his lips. He projected his voice, ensuring every corner of the restaurant heard his mockery. "Friend, I think you have the wrong address. The service entrance is around back." The humiliation hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Ben, however, didn't flinch. His eyes, a surprisingly clear blue, met Richard's without wavering, with a calmness that only served to enrage the CEO further. Seeing his first barb had failed to land, Richard raised his tone, turning mockery into a cruel command. "Security!" he bellowed, his face red with fury. "Dirty boots belong in a barn, not in here. Get this man out of my sight." The humiliation, once a weapon wielded by Richard, now turned back on him with the force of a tidal wave. The name Golden Valley Ranch echoed in the silent room, but to the CEO, it sounded like the shattering of his own crystal world. Ben's words into the phone were not a threat, they were a sentence. "Cancel the entire contract, permanently." Each syllable was a nail in Patrician's coffin. Richard felt the air leave his lungs, the blood run cold in his veins. The mocking smile froze on his face, transforming into a mask of pure panic. Golden Valley Ranch. It couldn't be. That mythical name, the source of all his fortune and prestige, belonged to the simple man standing before him, whose boots he had just insulted. The legendary cattle baron, a figure he'd imagined as a reclusive tycoon, an eccentric billionaire who communicated only through lawyers. Was this quiet man with serene eyes and calloused hands? The buzz of wealthy patrons turned into a heavy, accusatory silence. All eyes, once admiring of his power, now shot daggers at him, a mix of shock and poorly disguised pleasure at witnessing a tyrant's fall. He could feel the weight of their judgment, the veiled satisfaction in seeing the arrogant CEO put in his place. His empire, which had seemed as solid as gold in a vault, revealed itself to be a house of cards, and the man he had just humiliated held the foundational card. Without that beef, Patrician was just another expensive restaurant with a fancy name. His businesses, his investments, the entire net worth he had spent years building, it all depended on that contract. The exorbitant profit that set him apart from his competitors came from that exclusivity. Without it, he was nothing. The castle was crumbling before his eyes. Ben disconnected the old flip phone, the click sounding like a thunderclap in the sepulchral silence. He pocketed the phone and, with the same unshakable calm, faced the visibly trembling CEO. Richard's arrogance dissolved like smoke, replaced by abject desperation. You can't do this," he stammered, his voice cracking, stripped of all its former authority. He took a step forward, his hands outstretched in a pleading gesture. "My career, my restaurant, it depends on your beef." The confession escaped his lips like a wail, an admission of his total and complete vulnerability in front of his entire clientele. He wasn't the orchestra's conductor, he was just the owner of the theater, and the entire orchestra was walking out. "It depended," Ben corrected, his voice low but as sharp as broken glass. He adjusted his hat, a simple gesture that seemed to Richard like the final act of a judge delivering an irrevocable sentence. Richard's world spun, the image of his life unraveling flashed through his mind. Tomorrow's headlines, the plummeting value of his assets, financial ruin. Cold, paralyzing fear seized every fiber of his being. In an act of pure survival instinct, all his dignity evaporated. He did the only thing his terrified brain could conceive. In front of everyone, Richard, the multimillionaire, the titan of Manhattan's culinary scene, fell to his knees. The sound of his knees hitting the marble echoed through the room, a dull, pathetic thud. His desperate hands clutched at the rancher's dusty pant leg, smearing his expensive suit with the same red dust he had despised moments before. "No, for the love of God, I'm begging you." His voice came out as a ragged sob. "Don't cancel. I'll do anything. I'll give you the restaurant." The silence in Patrician was a living entity, heavy and suffocating. Every patron, moments before, absorbed in conversations about business and the returns on their hedge funds, was now paralyzed, an eyewitness to the implosion of a titan. Richard remained on his knees, the expensive fabric of his suit stained with red dirt, his hands still clutching Ben's pant leg like a drowning man clings to wreckage. His eyes, once glinting with arrogance, were now cloudy with panic and supplication. To him, that cold marble floor was rock bottom, and the calm, imposing figure of the rancher was the only rope that could pull him back up. The desperate offer, "I'll give you the restaurant," hung in the air, a pathetic sacrifice made too late. His entire net worth, his identity, offered in exchange for forgiveness. Ben looked down, not at the kneeling CEO, but at the hands gripping his trousers. There was a hint of sadness in his eyes, not triumph. With a slow, deliberate movement, he bent slightly and, with unexpected gentleness, pried Richard's fingers from his leg, one by one. The contact was brief, but to Richard, it felt like the last of his hope slipping through his fingers. The rancher then straightened up, brushing off his pant leg with a simple gesture as if wiping away unimportant dust. His voice, when it came, was low but carried a dignity that filled the hall. "I don't want your restaurant," he said, and each word was a shovelful of dirt on the CEO's hopes. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the luxurious room, the shocked faces, the opulence that seemed so hollow in that moment. "I just wanted dinner." The simplicity of that sentence hit Richard harder than any shout or accusation. It was a mirror to his own pettiness. While he had built an empire on exclusivity and humiliation, this man, the true source of his wealth, had only wanted a meal. Richard's mind went into a tailspin, a malfunctioning calculator projecting the disaster. The contract cancellation didn't just mean the loss of his best product, it meant the annihilation of his brand. He envisioned his group's stock plummeting on Monday morning, the panic of his investors, the dissolution of his fortune, the dollars in his offshore accounts, the gold in his vaults. All his assets felt suddenly intangible, ethereal, in the face of his primary business's ruin. The cash flow would dry up, the dividends would cease, it would be the end. The silence was broken by a murmur, then another. The spell was broken. Smartphones, once discreetly pocketed, emerged. Small red recording lights blinked in the dimness of the room. Richard's private humiliation was being immortalized, turned into viral content, ready to be consumed and shared, destroying what was left of his reputation. He looked up and saw Marcus, his biggest rival in the industry, sitting at a nearby table. Marcus wasn't recording. He was simply watching, a thin, predatory smile on his lips, as he slightly raised his wine glass in a silent, cruel salute. In that moment, Richard understood that his fall wouldn't just be a loss, it would be a feast for his enemies. Ignoring the forming circus, Ben turned his back on Richard and walked toward the exit with steady, unhurried steps. He didn't look back. With each step, Richard's hope dwindled until it was extinguished completely when the heavy wooden doors closed behind the rancher, muffling the sounds of the street and sealing his fate. Richard was left alone, kneeling in the center of his ruined kingdom, the sound of whispers and camera clicks growing around him like the buzz of approaching vultures. The empire had fallen, and its king was naked, exposed, and irretrievably broken. The sound of Richard's knees hitting the marble was the end of his era. For an instant that felt like an eternity, he remained there, paralyzed, the world around him moving in slow motion. The flashes from the phones were like lightning in a storm brewing inside him, and the patron's whispers were the distant thunder announcing the destruction. He looked up and met Marcus's eyes again, who now didn't even bother to hide his smile. It was the smile of a predator, celebrating a victory he didn't have to fight for. In that moment, Richard understood the fragility of his empire. He had spent his life accumulating assets, diversifying investments, and building a net worth he believed to be unshakable. But he suddenly realized his greatest liability was his own arrogance, a debt that had just been called in with devastating interest. His net worth, once a source of infinite pride, now seemed like an empty number, unable to save him from the ruin he had created. "Mr. Sterling," the voice was trembling. It was Arthur, the floor manager, a loyal man who had worked with him for over a decade. Face pale, he extended a hand to help his boss up. Richard ignored it. Using a nearby table for support, he staggered to his feet, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. Every glance was a dagger, every whisper a blow. He crossed the room in a daze, the path to the mezzanine staircase feeling like a journey of miles. He didn't see faces, just blurs of curiosity and contempt. His mind, usually a sharp instrument for calculating profits and predicting market trends, was short-circuiting. He was trying to process the avalanche of consequences, the public humiliation, the loss of the contract, the media backlash, the collapse of his stock on Wall Street. The income generated by this restaurant was the spine of all his other businesses. Without it, everything would crumble. He locked himself in his office, the sanctuary from which he commanded his world. The silence, once a luxury, was now oppressive. He threw himself into his Italian leather armchair, the same one from which he had watched Ben's arrival. On his desk, a photo in a silver frame stared back at him. A younger him, next to his father, on the day he took full control of the family business. His father's gaze in the photo seemed disappointed. His father had built the foundation of this fortune with hard work and respect, values Richard had dismissed as weaknesses. He had turned his father's dream into a monument to his own arrogance, and now the monument was in ruins. The pain in his chest was physical, a crushing pressure. It wasn't just about the money, the loss of capital. It was about the annihilation of his identity. Who was he without Patrician, without the title of the infallible CEO? Just a broken man, kneeling in his own failure. The shrill ring of the phone on his desk made him jump. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. He looked at the caller ID, and his heart sank even further. It was Laura, his younger sister, the artist of the family, the dreamer he had always belittled for her lack of financial ambition. He had ignored her for weeks, too busy with his deals and assets to answer her calls. Now she was the first to call. He knew why. The video must already be circulating, the news of his disgrace spreading like wildfire. He let it ring, the sound piercing his eardrums, each ring an accusation. The call went to voicemail, but immediately the phone rang again, insistent. She wouldn't give up. With a trembling hand, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, he answered, but he couldn't say a word. On the other end of the line, Laura's voice, choked but firm, asked the only question that mattered. Richard, what did you do? Laura's question, Richard, what did you do? Echoed in the silent office, disarming him completely. There was no accusation in her voice, just a deep sadness, a disappointment that hurt more than any newspaper headline ever could. For a long moment, the only reply was the sound of his own ragged breathing. The words were caught in his throat, choked by the weight of shame. He wanted to scream, to blame the rancher, fate, anything. But the truth was a cruel mirror, reflecting his own image. I don't know, he finally whispered, his voice hoarse and unrecognizable. It was the most honest admission he had made in years. On the other end of the line, Laura sighed. I saw the video. Richard, everyone has. She didn't need to say more. The humiliation was now global. Every view, every share, another nail in his social coffin. I'm going to fix this, he said, more to himself than to her, trying to summon the old CEO, the man who solved problems with a phone call and a wire transfer. I'll move heaven and earth. I'll offer him double, triple. Every man has a price. His mind started racing, calculating the financial impact, planning damage control strategies to protect his other businesses. His investments in gold and crypto that suddenly seemed like the only safe part of his net worth. He had to limit the liabilities, stop the bleeding. And don't be a fool, Laura's voice cut him off, sharp. You still don't get it, do you? This was never about money. Dad always said Golden Valley Ranch was the soul of our business, not just a supplier. The mention of his father opened an old wound. A vivid memory hit him. He, in his 20s, impatient to take over, arguing with his father about modernizing the brand. Respect is the greatest asset we have, Richard, the old man had said. And our partnership with Golden Valley is our treasure. The day you treat the root of our fortune like a simple line item, you'll start to die on the inside. At the time, he'd thought it was outdated sentimentality. The philosophy of a man who didn't understand the new world of business, of aggressive profitability and optimized cash flow. Now, his father's words haunted him like a fulfilled prophecy. He had traded the soul of the business for profit, and now he had neither. What do you want me to do, Laura? He asked, his voice broken, devoid of any trace of arrogance. It was a genuine plea for help, the first in over a decade. He could almost feel her surprise on the other end. There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her tone was softer yet carried a weight he didn't understand. I don't know if there's anything to be done, but the man you humiliated, Ben, I know of him. Or rather, I know his reputation. Richard sat up straight, his heart hammering. How? A friend of mine, a potter, moved out to the country a few years ago, to a small town near where he lives. She always talks about him. He's different. He takes care of the community, helps everyone. The money he makes from the ranch, he reinvests almost all of it into the people there. The information landed like an anvil in Richard's mind. He had tried to humiliate a man who was the pillar of an entire community. The desperation returned with full force. Where is he, Laura? He needed a chance, however small, to try to reverse the damage. Laura hesitated for a moment, as if weighing her response. He lives in a place called Blue Ridge, but Richard, she paused, and he held his breath. You won't find him with your luxury car and your designer suit. If you really want a chance to be heard, you'll have to go alone with nothing that defines you. You need to leave your fortune behind and take only the man who knelt on the restaurant floor. Laura's suggestion, leave your fortune behind, sounded to Richard like a foreign language. How could he do that? His identity, his security, every fiber of his being was intertwined with his net worth, his assets, the rising numbers in his investment accounts. The idea of stripping himself of all that, even symbolically, was terrifying. He looked around his office, at the designer furniture, the panoramic view of the glittering city, and it all felt like a gilded cage. For the first time, he felt like a prisoner of his own wealth. The night dragged on in a silent torment. He didn't sleep. The words of his father, Laura, and Ben mingled in his mind, a chorus of accusations and truths he had spent a lifetime ignoring. The sun rose, casting a grey light over the city, and found Richard still in the same armchair, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained, a dark stubble on his jaw. The man in the mirror was a stranger, a ghost haunting the ruins of a life. He made a decision. It wasn't an act of courage, but of pure desperation. It was the last gamble of a player who had already lost everything. Following Laura's advice, he left his latest smartphone on the desk, his gold watch in the drawer. He went down to the underground garage, walking past his collection of imported sports cars, and chose the oldest, most unassuming vehicle he owned, a Jeep he rarely used for visiting construction sites. He put on a simple pair of jeans and a cotton shirt, clothes he barely remembered owning. Each step away from his usual world felt like a leap into the dark. As he left the building, the doorman, used to seeing him in impeccable attire, gave him a look of utter confusion, but Richard didn't stop to explain. He drove out of the city, leaving behind the skyscrapers that were monuments to his power, feeling increasingly naked and vulnerable. The drive to Blue Ridge was a journey into himself. The urban landscape of concrete and glass gave way to green rolling hills and dirt roads. The air changed, the smell of pollution replaced by that of grass and damp earth. Richard, who had spent the last decade focused on global markets and the dollar's exchange rate, was forced to pay attention to the real world, a world that existed independently of his cash flow. He stopped at a small roadside diner to eat. The first time in years he'd entered a place where no one knew his name or the value of his stock. He ate a simple plate of fried chicken, beans and cornbread, and the taste of real food, without the pomp and luxury, surprised him. He watched the people around him, families laughing, workers chatting, and felt a pang of something he couldn't name. A mix of envy and loneliness. They possessed a wealth that couldn't be measured in euros or Bitcoin. He reached Blue Ridge late in the afternoon. The town was small, charming in its simplicity, with a central square and a little white church. The people on the street looked at him with curiosity, but without the judgment he'd felt in his restaurant. He asked for Ben at a general store, and the owner, an old man with a white mustache, eyed him with suspicion. "Depends who's asking," the man said. Protective. Richard swallowed, his pride still fighting to die. "My name is Richard. "I really need to speak with him. It's a personal matter." The man studied him for a long moment, then seemed to see something in Richard's eyes, perhaps the genuine desperation that made him relent. "The ranch is about 6 miles out. Follow the dirt road past the bridge. Can't miss it. The gate is wooden, with a carved sun on it." Richard thanked him and followed the directions, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was approaching the epicenter of his ruin, the place that had birthed his fortune and could now seal his fate forever. The gate with the carved sun appeared around a bend. He stopped the car, the engine sounding absurdly loud in the rural silence. He got out, his hands sweating, and pushed open the heavy wooden gate. Before him stretched a valley of impossible green, and in the distance, a simple house with a welcoming porch. And there, sitting in a rocking chair, as if he had been expecting him, was Ben. The walk from the gate to the house felt like the longest of Richard's life. Each step on the soft red earth was a reminder of his ignorance, his disconnection from the source of his own fortune. Ben remained in the rocking chair, watching his approach with the same indecipherable calm he had displayed in the restaurant. There was no anger in his eyes, no triumph, just a stillness that was somehow more intimidating than any fury. Richard stopped before the porch steps, the words of apology he had rehearsed for the entire drive dying on his lips. They seemed hollow, inadequate. To talk about business, about the damage to his assets or the fall of his stock, felt like sacrilege in this place. He, the master negotiator, was speechless. "Ben," he began, his voice failing, I came to apologize. What I did was unforgivable. I was arrogant, blind. I will do anything to fix it. Anything." Ben stopped the gentle rocking of his chair with one foot. He studied Richard's face for a moment, as if searching for something beyond the desperation. Then, to Richard's astonishment, he stood up and gestured with his head toward the front door. "Come on in, son. Let's have some coffee." The unexpected hospitality disarmed him completely. He had expected shouting, accusations, a door slammed in his face, not an invitation to come inside. He walked up the wooden steps, feeling clumsy and out of place. The inside of the house was simple but warm. The smell of fresh coffee and cornbread hung in the air. Dark wood furniture, polished by time, and family photos on the walls told the story of a lifetime. There were no signs of great wealth, none of the status symbols Richard surrounded himself with. There was only the richness of a life well lived. Ben poured 2 mugs of coffee at a small kitchen table. He sat and watched Richard, who remained standing and uncomfortable. "Sit," the rancher said, his voice gentle. Richard obeyed, his large, nervous hands wrapping around the warm mug. He tried to speak again to reiterate his apology, but Ben held up a hand. Before you say anything, I want to show you something." He stood and walked to a wall in the living room, stopping in front of an old, black and white photograph in a simple wooden frame. He waited for Richard to approach. In the photo, 2 young men in their 20s smiled at the camera. One was a clearly recognizable Ben. The other, Richard's heart stopped. The other was his father. They had their arms around each other, standing in this very valley. The same hill in the background, his father's face radiant with hope and pride. "Your father and I," Ben began, his voice thick with nostalgia, "we started this whole thing together. He had a dream of creating the best steakhouse in New York, and I had a dream of raising the best beef in the country. We didn't have much capital, just a dream and each other's word. Golden Valley Ranch was our investment, a partnership. He trusted me to take care of the soul of the business, while he took care of the body, there in the city." Richard felt the floor disappear from beneath his feet. The story he knew of his father building an empire alone was a lie, or at best, a half-truth. The man he had humiliated was not a simple supplier. He was the co-founder of everything, the guardian of the original promise. His arrogance hadn't just cost him a contract. It had desecrated his own father's legacy. "I didn't know," Richard whispered, the shock draining all the color from his face. Ben turned to him, his clear blue eyes locking onto his, and in them was a deep pain. "I know you didn't. That's why I'm telling you. Your father made me promise him something before he died, Richard, a promise that directly involves you." The revelation fell on Richard like an avalanche, burying everything he believed to be the foundation of his life. The black and white photograph seemed to mock him, a silent testament to a truth that changed everything. His father and Ben, partners, friends. Golden Valley Ranch wasn't a simple supplier his father had brilliantly discovered and signed to an exclusive contract. It was part of his inheritance, a living, breathing part of which he had never been aware. The fortune he managed and multiplied with such pride wasn't just his by right. It was a shared legacy, a trust placed in him by two men, not just one. The vertigo was so intense he had to lean against the wall. He wasn't the genius who had surpassed his father. He was the ignorant heir who had nearly destroyed a life's work with a single act of stupidity. The humiliation in the restaurant was nothing compared to this deep, existential shame. "And the promise," Richard managed to say, his voice a thread. "What promise?" Ben turned away from the photo, his gaze lost in memory. "Your father was a good man, but he knew human nature. He saw the fire in you, the same ambition he had, but he feared that without the right foundation, that fire could burn down everything around it. He made me promise that if you ever got lost in the glare of the money, if your arrogance threatened to destroy the values we built all this on, I was to intervene." Ben paused, and the weight of that old promise filled the room. "He gave me the right to give you a single chance, not to renegotiate the contract, but to redeem yourself as a man." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. This was worse than any lawsuit, worse than bankruptcy. This was a moral judgment, delivered from the past, executed by the man before him. What do I have to do?" he asked, desperation coloring every word. He was ready to offer any sum, transfer shares, cede part of his net worth. He was willing to pay any amount of interest on his mistake. But Ben's answer did not belong to the world of finance. "The contract isn't cancelled, Richard. It's suspended," the rancher said, and a tiny grain of hope sprouted in Richard's chest, only to be crushed by what came next. "It will be reinstated if, and only if you prove you are worthy of your father's legacy." "Worthy? How?" Richard asked, confusion clouding his reason. Ben walked to the porch door and looked out at the valley, which was bathed in the golden light of dusk. "You're going to stay here, on the ranch. You will work like any other man who earns his bread with the sweat he spills on this land. You will wake up before the sun. You will smell the barn that offended you so much. You will learn the name of every animal and every employee. You will understand that the beef that arrives at your restaurant isn't a product. It's the result of the lives and effort of dozens of people. You will trade your suit for work clothes and your ego for calluses." The proposal was so absurd, so surreal, that Richard almost laughed. Him, a multi-millionaire, working as a ranch hand. It was a humiliation on a scale he couldn't even conceive. But as he looked at Ben's serious face, he knew it wasn't a joke. It was his one and only chance. "Your first job starts at dawn," Ben said, turning to face him. "The foreman doesn't tolerate being late. The choice is yours, Richard. The gate is open if you want to leave, but if you do, it will close forever." The night at Golden Valley Ranch was the longest of Richard's life. The guest room was simple, the bed harder than he was used to, and the silence of the countryside, broken only by the distant chirp of a cricket, was louder than any city siren. Lying in the dark, he stared at the ceiling and the impossible choice he'd been given. His mind, an engine trained to maximize profits and optimize deals, spun with rage and humiliation. To work with his own hands, the idea was so repulsive, so contrary to his nature, that his body tensed in disgust. He was a commander, a capital strategist. He didn't handle tools, he signed checks. With every passing hour, the urge to get up, get in his jeep, and flee this nightmare became almost unbearable. He could leave, go back to his world, use his immense fortune to crush the problem. He'd hire the best lawyers, the most creative marketing experts. He'd find another supplier, maybe even overseas, paying in dollars or euros if he had to. But for the first time, he was faced with a problem his money couldn't solve. The truth hit him with the force of a punch to the gut. Patrician didn't sell beef, it sold the legend of Golden Valley Ranch. Without the ranch, he just had an expensive restaurant with nice decor. His brand, the primary asset of his empire, was fatally wounded. The story of his humiliation and the origin of his product would spread. Marcus and his other rivals would feast on his ruins. The suspended contract wasn't a cash flow problem. It was the annihilation of his brand equity, something no financial asset could repair. And then there was the memory of his father. It returned in flashes, not of the ruthless businessman, but of the man. He remembered a day, as a teenager, when his father had brought him to the ranch. Richard had complained the entire time about the smell, the heat, the lack of cell service. His father had patiently tried to show him the beauty of the place, the cycle of life, the hard work that resulted in excellence. "This right here, son," he had said, gesturing to the valley, "is our real treasure. The rest is just a consequence." Richard, at the time, had rolled his eyes, thinking the real treasure was in the bank statements. How blind he had been. The decision crystallized as the first rays of sun painted the sky a pale pink. It was not a choice made from hope or virtue. It was a choice born from the complete and utter absence of alternatives. Fleeing meant certain ruin and dishonoring his father's legacy. Staying meant profound humiliation, but with a spark, the faintest possibility of salvation. He got up, his body aching from the sleepless night. On a chair, someone had left a pair of thick jeans, a worn shirt, and a pair of heavy, already broken-in leather boots. Putting on those clothes felt like shedding his own skin for another man's. It was the uniform of his self-annihilation. He looked at himself in a small, chipped mirror on the wall. The image that stared back was not that of the multi-millionaire CEO, but of a lost man, about to pay a debt he never knew he owed. He opened the door, and the cool morning air hit his face. The smell was of damp earth, grass, and yes, the barn. But this time it didn't seem offensive. It just seemed real. In the yard in front of the house, a man was waiting for him. It was not Ben. This man was shorter, stocky, with powerful arms and a sun-beaten face that held no trace of sympathy. His small, penetrating eyes measured Richard from head to toe with a contempt he didn't bother to hide. This was Jonas, the ranch foreman. "So the city prince decided to stay," he said, his voice rough and gravelly as he spit a piece of tobacco onto the ground. "And Ben told me, you ask me, you won't last till lunch." Jonas grabbed a shovel leaning against the fence and threw it on the ground near Richard's feet. The metal hit the dirt with a hard, final thud. "Champion's stall is filthy. He doesn't like stepping in his own manure. Pick it up. The work won't do itself." Richard stared at the shovel as if it were an artifact from an unknown civilization. In his hands, which had signed multi-million-dollar contracts and typed stock-buying orders with cold precision, the rough wood of the handle felt like an insult. The metal of the blade, stained with dirt and use, was a brutal counterpoint to the polished gold of his watch, now tucked away hundreds of miles away. For a moment, the absurdity of the situation paralyzed him. He, whose net worth was the subject of envy and business magazines, was about to shovel manure. Jonas, the foreman, watched him with his arms crossed, a smirk of pure contempt on his face, waiting for the inevitable surrender. That look was the fuel Richard needed. With a sigh that was more a frustrated growl, He drove the shovel into the bed of soiled hay. The resistance was immediate, the task far more physical than he could have ever imagined. The first few minutes were torture. His muscles, accustomed to controlled Pilates sessions and the comfort of ergonomic chairs, protested with sharp, stabbing pains. The smell, which he had once found offensive from a distance, was now intimate, suffocating, seeping into his clothes and skin. Sweat poured down his forehead and stung his eyes. His hands, soft and manicured, soon blistered, the skin breaking open and raw. The pain was a welcome distraction from the humiliation. He moved awkwardly, inefficiently, each shovelful a battle against his own unpreparedness. His mind, usually a refuge, became a battlefield. He found himself mentally calculating the loss each second on this ranch represented to his businesses, the drop in returns on his funds, the loss of dividends. But strangely, the numbers felt distant, abstract. The weight of the shovel, the pain in his hands, and the smell of the stall were the only reality. "Any day now, Princess," Jonas's voice cut through the air like a whip. "At this rate, the horse will have to ask permission to enter his own home." Richard gritted his teeth, ignoring the taunt. The anger was a pure energy, and he channeled it into the work, his movements becoming more desperate, stronger. He filled one wheelbarrow, then another. The pile of manure seemed to never shrink, a modern-day Sisyphus punished for his own arrogance. At a moment of exhaustion, he paused to catch his breath, leaning on the shovel handle, his chest heaving. It was then that a young man, who couldn't have been more than 18, walked past. The young man watched him for a second, noticing the wrong posture that was straining his lower back. With a quick glance toward Jonas, who had his back turned, the young man approached. "If you brace the shovel against your thigh and use your leg for leverage, you'll use your arms less," he said in a low voice, almost a whisper, before continuing on his way without waiting for a reply. That small gesture of solidarity, a drop of humanity in an ocean of hostility, hit Richard in an unexpected way. He tried what the kid suggested, and it worked. The movement became a little easier, the ache in his back a little more bearable. He didn't know the boy's name, but he felt a gratitude that surprised him. After what felt like a lifetime, the last of the filth was removed. The stall floor was clean. He spread the new straw, its fresh, sweet smell a relief to his overwhelmed senses. He was filthy, exhausted, and sore in places he didn't know existed. But he had finished. A tiny, stubborn sprout of satisfaction emerged from the misery. He turned to Jonas, expecting, if not praise, at least an end to the ordeal. The foreman inspected the work with a critical eye, kicking at a corner of the straw. He shrugged, showing no emotion. "About time. That was just the warm-up," Jonas said, pointing with his chin beyond the stable. "Now we're headed to the pig pen. The hogs are a lot less organized than Champion." The word warm-up echoed in Richard's mind as he followed Jonas toward the pig pen. If the horse's stall had been purgatory, this was undoubtedly the deepest circle of hell. The smell hit him first, an ammoniacal, earthy wave that made him gag, his stomach churning in protest. He, who had debated the pairing of rare wines with dishes costing tens of thousands of dollars, was now facing a sea of cold, foul-smelling mud, punctuated by the satisfied grunts of its occupants. Jonas handed him a high-pressure hose and a long, heavy squeegee. "The drainage system's clogged. You'll have to clear the thick of it with the squeegee first, then wash everything down and watch you don't get bit. They aren't too fond of visitors." The foreman leaned against the fence, lighting a hand-rolled cigarette, the sadism plain in his smile. This wasn't a test of endurance. It was a ritual of degradation. Richard felt the last vestige of his old self crumble. The rage that had moved him in the stall gave way to a cold despair. This was it. He couldn't do it. His body ached, his hands were bleeding, and his dignity was in tatters. It was easier to give up, accept the ruin. Go back to the city and try to salvage the pieces of his fortune that remained. He could liquidate his assets, sell his properties, maybe start over with whatever capital was left. But then, the image of his father's gaze in the old photograph returned to his mind, followed by the image of Ben, calm and resolute. To quit now wasn't just a business failure, it was a betrayal of a history he was only beginning to understand. Clenching his fists, feeling the sharp sting of his broken blisters, he took the first step into the pig pen. The mud sucked his boot down to the ankle, a baptism of filth. The work was disgusting and brutally exhausting. Pushing the heavy, thick slurry with the squeegee required a strength he didn't possess. He fell to his knees several times, covering himself in muck. The pigs, curious and indifferent, bumped into him, making him even filthier. Every muscle in his body screamed in agony. Amidst the exertion, his mind wandered to absurd places. He remembered a meeting in Zurich, discussing the profitability of euro-denominated investment funds in an air-conditioned room overlooking the lake. He remembered closing a multi-million-dollar deal via video conference, the most physical exertion being the lifting of a coffee cup. The dissonance between his past and present was so vast, so unfathomable, that the situation bordered on the comical. He, the billionaire, wallowing in mud to save what was left of his inheritance. It was then that he saw the same young man from the morning, Leo, on the other side of the pen, mending a section of the fence with quiet skill. He didn't look at Richard with pity or contempt, just with a calm acceptance. For Leo, this was just another day's work, a necessary part of the cycle that ultimately produced the most coveted beef in the country. Richard realized that for these people, the land wasn't an asset to be exploited for profit. It was a partner, an entity to be respected and cared for. Hard work wasn't a punishment. It was a dialogue with that partner. For the first time, he didn't just feel humiliation. He felt a strange, uncomfortable pang of respect. After hours of superhuman effort, the drain was finally visible. Exhausted, covered in mud from head to toe, Richard dragged himself out of the pen and leaned against the fence. Trembling with fatigue and cold, he raised his gaze toward the main house, his eyes searching for something without knowing what. On the porch, silhouetted against the afternoon light, was Ben. He wasn't smiling or scowling. He was just watching. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that silence, Richard felt the weight of a judgment far more profound than that of any stock exchange. Ben's gaze from the porch held neither condemnation nor approval. It held something far more complex, assessment. He was watching Richard not as a judge watches a defendant, but as a craftsman eyes a piece of raw timber, trying to discern if, beneath the rough, soiled bark, there was still a strong, usable core. Richard, exhausted and covered in filth, held the gaze, feeling utterly exposed. For the first time in his life, he wasn't being evaluated by his net worth, his bank account, or his ability to generate profit. He was being measured by his character, and he felt the scale was tipping dangerously to the negative. He expected an order, a new command from Jonas for the next humiliating task, but nothing came. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that he had never noticed from his office window in the city. The workday seemed to be over. It was then that a shout cut through the evening peace. "Ben, it's Star! The calf won't turn!" It was Leo, the young man who had helped him earlier, running from the birthing barn, his face pale with panic. In an instant, the atmosphere on the ranch transformed. Calm gave way to an electric urgency. Ben was down the porch steps in 2 strides, his age seeming to vanish, replaced by an energetic authority. Jonas threw his cigarette to the ground and ran in the same direction. Other hands appeared from different points, all converging on the same spot. Richard, left behind, felt the urge to stay put, to remove himself from the problem. This wasn't his business, but something compelled him to follow. A morbid curiosity, or perhaps the first seed of a sense of belonging to this place. Inside the barn, the scene was one of controlled chaos. A large, mottled cow, Star, was lying on her side, her breath coming in heavy, ragged gasps, her eyes rolling with pain and exhaustion. Ben was at her side, speaking to her in a low, soothing tone as he assessed the situation. "Vet won't make it in time. He's on the other side of the mountain," Jonas said, his voice tense. "We're going to have to deliver it ourselves. Leo, the ropes and the disinfectant. Quick!" The air was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and antiseptic. Richard watched from the doorway, feeling like an intruder, a useless spectator in the midst of a real crisis. This was a true life and death struggle, not the fluctuation of percentage points on a stock market. Here, what was at stake wasn't capital, but existence itself. "The legs are stuck. It's not coming out like this," Ben said, his face creased with worry. "Jonas, I need you to pull with me, firm but gentle." The two men positioned themselves, ropes attached to the calf's barely visible hooves. They pulled once, twice, the muscles in their arms straining with the effort. The cow lowed, a long guttural sound of agony, but the calf didn't move. Panic began to seep into the men's determination. "It's no good. We don't have enough strength," Jonas said, panting. "We're going to lose them both." The despair in the foreman's voice was palpable. It was then that Ben's eyes swept the barn, past the anxious faces of the ranch hands, and landed, finally, on Richard, standing in the shadows. There was no time for questions, for tests, or for pride. There was only the raw, immediate need for another pair of hands. The choice was no longer Richard's. Life was forcing it. Without thinking, he stepped forward, out of the darkness and into the circle of light from the barn's lamp. Ben just nodded, a minimal gesture, but one laden with immense meaning. Here, beside me, his hands, once soft and now raw, gripped the rope next to Ben's calloused ones. "Pull!" the old rancher shouted, his voice strained. "Now, with everything you've got." Ben's command was the only thing that existed in Richard's universe. The world shrank to the rough rope in his raw hands, the slick floor beneath his boots, and the sound of his own gasping breath mixed with the grunts of the men and the cow's laments. The pain in his hands vanished, consumed by a wave of adrenaline and a visceral purpose he had never felt closing a multi-million-dollar deal. He was not Richard the CEO. He was just another man, fighting against death and for life. He pulled, using the strength of his shoulders, his legs, a desperate will not to fail. He felt Ben's muscles tense beside him, the focused power of Jonas on the other side. They were three men from completely different worlds, united by a single, primitive goal. There was a final cry from Star, one last desperate pull, and then suddenly a release. With a wet, slippery sound, the calf was born, tumbling onto the straw in a tangle of long, thin legs. For an instant, the ensuing silence was absolute, broken only by the heavy breathing of the three men and the exhausted mother. The small animal didn't move. The panic, which had barely receded, threatened to return. But then, its small head lifted, wobbly, and a weak, bleating sound cut through the barn air. A collective sigh of relief swept through the small group. Star, with tremendous effort, turned her head and began to vigorously lick her newborn. Leo, with tears in his eyes, threw a cloth over the small, trembling body, helping to dry it. Richard let go of the rope, his hands shaking uncontrollably, and took a step back, stumbling into a bale of hay. He slid down onto it, his body suddenly heavy, drained of all strength. He watched the scene, the mother and her calf, the raw, messy miracle of life, and felt something inside him break. The shell of arrogance, cynicism, and pride he had built around himself for decades finally shattered, revealing the vulnerable man beneath. Jonas, the foreman, walked over to him. Richard braced himself for another taunt, but the man just extended a hand. It wasn't a gesture of friendship, but of acknowledgement. You earned your dirt today. City boy, he said, his voice still rough but without the earlier contempt. Richard took the hand and let himself be pulled to his feet. The handshake was firm, the foreman's calluses scraping against his injured skin. It was the first sign of respect he had received there. Later that night, after Calm had returned to the ranch, Richard sat on the porch steps, looking up at the starry sky, clearer and more vast than anything he had ever seen from the city. His father's true inheritance wasn't the money or the assets, it was this land, this partnership, this way of life. Ben came out of the house and sat beside him in his rocking chair. They sat in silence for a long time, just listening to the sounds of the night. "That contract your father and I signed," Ben said finally, his voice soft. "It was just a piece of paper. The real partnership was in the respect, in the trust that one would look after the other's work as if it were his own. You broke that trust, Richard." "I know," Richard replied, his voice low, "and I'm sorry. More than words can say." He turned to the older man. "I don't want the contract back because my business depends on it. I want the chance to deserve it, to honor what my father and you built." Ben looked at him, his blue eyes reflecting the starlight. A small smile, the first Richard had seen, touched his lips. "Hard work is a good start, but respect takes a lifetime to build." He stood up. "The contract is reactivated, Richard. Next week's delivery will be made as always, but the promise I made your father still stands." Richard stood as well, his heart racing. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just honor the name you carry," Ben said, extending his hand. Richard shook it, not as the CEO of Patrician, but as his partner's son. Back in his room, he saw the jeep that had brought him there. For the first time, he didn't feel the urge to escape. He felt that, somehow, he was finally home. He borrowed the landline from the living room and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Hello?" Laura's sleepy voice answered. "Laura, it's me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I found my way back." The journey back to New York City was the opposite of the one he'd taken out. The jeep, which had once felt like an escape vehicle from his humiliation, was now a capsule for reflection. Richard drove slowly, no longer tormented by the imminent loss of his net worth, but absorbed by the rediscovery of his inheritance. The city lights, appearing on the horizon, no longer seemed to be just the gleam of his businesses and fortune. They looked like an invitation to rebuild something with real purpose. He understood that his father and Ben hadn't just created a successful business. They had cultivated a relationship of trust, an asset far more valuable than any stock on Wall Street or bar of gold. He had spent his entire life measuring his wealth in dollars. But the true fortune, the one that really mattered, was intangible, and he had almost destroyed it completely. He arrived at Patrician the next morning. News of the contract's reactivation had already spread, but the staff awaited him with visible apprehension, expecting the tyrant's return. But the man who walked into the restaurant was not the same one who had left. His simple clothes and the exhaustion on his face were the least of the changes. The arrogance in his eyes had been replaced by a thoughtful serenity. He didn't go up to his mezzanine. Instead, he gathered the entire staff in the main dining room. "I was wrong," he said, his voice firm, but without its former harshness. "I disrespected not only a good man, but the very soul of this place. That is going to change." The shock on the employees' faces was palpable. He spent the rest of the day making decisions that would have horrified any financial consultant. The first was to remove the enormous, cold, abstract sculpture that dominated the room, a status symbol that had cost him a small fortune, and replace it with a single, large photograph framed in rustic wood, the black and white image of his father and a young Ben, smiling at Golden Valley Ranch. Next, he rewrote the menu. The signature dish, formerly called the Emperor's Diamond, was renamed. It was now called the Golden Valley Cut, a legacy of friendship. Beside the name, A short text told the story of the two men who started it all with a dream and a handshake. He was transforming his greatest product from a symbol of elitist exclusivity into a celebration of loyalty and hard work. That evening, the restaurant reopened. The atmosphere was different. The photograph on the wall changed everything, adding warmth and history to a place that had once been cold and impersonal. Laura showed up, unannounced, and when she saw the photo, her eyes filled with tears. She simply hugged him, a long, silent embrace that said everything. Richard, for the first time in years, felt the peace of a clear conscience. At the end of the night, he wasn't in his office counting the profits. He was in the dining room, watching the tables, the couples, the families. He no longer saw figures. He saw people sharing moments. His rival, Marcus, was at a table in the corner, his face a mask of confusion. Unable to comprehend why Richard was voluntarily diminishing his brand's market value, Richard smiled to himself. He and Marcus were no longer in the same business. Patrician was still the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan, but now, people weren't just paying for the beef or the status. They were paying for the story. They were paying for the authenticity. Richard finally understood that the greatest legacy his father had left him wasn't the capital or the assets, but a lesson on the true value of things. His greatest wealth wasn't kept in a bank, but in the red earth of Golden Valley Ranch and in the promise to honor his father's memory.